How do we compare when it comes to, performance, physical performance, knowledge about strength, etc., as athletes?
Very poor. I mean, if you look at other countries, the biggest problem is lack of education. But in the last 12 years, Britain has caught up a lot, right? You can even tell by the choice in gym equipment, and that has changed dramatically in 12 years. The problem, I would say the biggest problem in the UK is mainstream media. So there's a lot of myths still perpetrated. And I would say second biggest issue with the British market is actually the medical doctors. I mean, I'm not trying to offend anybody, but the culture in the medical British establishment is we're second authority after God, right? So they have this attitude, well, it's not in the research. Well, maybe you didn't read the research. So once they finish school, so there's a lot of stuff that is dramatically stupid that is still being done, but the doctor says so. So sometimes when I work with British executives, say, my doctor told me this, and I go, no, that's not true. We've known that for 60 years. So the British medical establishment, because of the socialized medicine, is limited. I think if they went more private, the quality would go up. And I think in the US, that's the biggest difference, is that it's a business, right? So then people have to compete to eat. Well, if you have a Canadian doctor, you get paid even if you're the last guy in your class. And you're still called doctor, but you could have been the dumbest guy in your class, but you're still going to get work.
Okay, so Canada suffers from the same problem as
yes,
the UK.
So in Australia.
Okay,
yes.
Because it's a socialized system where it's not a meritocracy.
But yeah.
What's a good example of like one of your execs, say in Britain, who gets like a bad piece of old advice where?
Well, for example, the treatment of blood pressure, right? So the guy says, okay, you have blood pressure, I'll put you on this med. But the reality is there's 6 genes that determine if you're going to have high blood pressure or not. And we know from genetic research that some nutrients can turn off the gene. So a gene is a gun, and the environment pulls on a trigger. So, for example, one of the nutrients that affects high blood pressure is magnesium. So when you put enough magnesium to your body, you turn off the blood pressure gene. I have all 6 genes for high blood pressure, and my blood pressure is excellent. But I take enough stuff to keep it at bay. So, but the thing is that in the US, maybe 1% of doctors would know that, right? But in the UK, I would say maybe 3 guys, and they were educated in the US, right? So this bank executive heard about me and presented high blood pressure, and I said, try this for 3 weeks, and he passed out at work. And the doctor says, like, what happened? He goes, oh, I started to take these nutrients. He goes, you got to go off blood pressure meds. I mean, your blood pressure is too low, right? And then after the doctor called me, and he says, like, what'd you give him? I told him, and he goes, well, there's no research on that. I said, do you have a computer? He goes, yes. I said, do you have an email? Yes. I said, let me send you the research. So I sent him the 60 latest articles on each nutrient for blood pressure, and he was like, I didn't know that existed. I said, well, that's the problem with the British system. You finish university, but your teachers don't even teach you that. That's the biggest issue.
Right.
So it's changing rapidly, but the UK, I would say, has about 40 years to catch up.
Okay. And what about the rest of the world? I mean, you're known as a guy that's always on the cutting edge of science. You're all about, let's look at the experiment, let's look at the facts. How does the rest of the world stack up? Are they still working on medical knowledge from 20, 40, 60 years ago? Pretty much.
The biggest problem is that when you go through med school, the average around the world for nutrition, for tuition, is 1 hour. So some universities have 3 hours and some universities have 0, because if the average is 1, that means it's more or less, right? And usually per country is like in Canada, read the Canada Food Guide, in the US, USDA guide, depending whatever the country is, but those are biased by the grain lobbies. So whether you're in Sweden or Denmark, like Denmark has had some really stupid laws. For example, they still think that saturated fats is the culprit. So they imposed a tax on butter so that people would eat less butter. But they should put a tax on bread if you want to reduce blood pressure and heart disease and cancer, because anything that jacks up your insulin will jack up pretty much any disease. So I would say the US is quite at the forefront. Finland is very good, but they still have their nutrition board that's not that well educated, but they actually do research. Italy, surprisingly enough, does some really good research in medicine, but they're better at gerontology. So everything we know about nutrients and other brain ages is actually pretty much from Italy.
I wouldn't have expected that.
Yeah, I mean, all the stuff I use for brain stuff, usually it's Italian medical doctors who first did the research.